All right. We have made it to Thursday. So now that we've gotten through, basic information about the class, we've talked about a little bit of foundational grammar, sentence structure stuff. Now we'll start to get into the real AP stuff, the persuasive stuff, which is such a foundational part of this class. So, I'm going to share some information with you, do a bit of practice, and then do a bit of analysis. So you'll notice that I have a decent number of documents that have been made due on Friday. The idea is not that you would do them all on Friday. So if you do them, kind of as the week goes along, then hopefully you find them, rather short, fairly easy. If you save them all at once, then I feel like that will be a bit more problematic. So just FYI, I realize that I have a decent amount of due dates for Friday, but I am hopeful that given the fact that A-Day students basically have kind of a catch-up day Friday, and hopefully B-Day students will finish up the AP baseline with maybe a little time to spare, I'm hopeful that that allows everyone enough time to get those documents finished and turned in and round out a good first week. So anyways, let's start talking about persuasive appeals and rhetoric. So the word rhetoric is the first thing that I will discuss with you. It's one of those fancy Greek terms that has kind of died out of common usage, but AP language loves the word rhetoric and rhetorical. It is a favorite. So rhetoric, all it is the art of effective or persuasive speaking or writing. So really, there isn't much difference between saying rhetoric and saying persuasion. They are virtually identical. But rhetoric does have a more sophisticated implication, perhaps. So it can be speaking or writing. Now, obviously, our primary forms of rhetoric that we'll be dealing with will be in writing, but we will analyze several speeches. So even something that has been delivered verbally can, later in writing form, still be rhetorically analyzed, just as much significance, good Lord, as a document that was intended to be read. So that is what rhetoric is. Persuasion. Just substitute persuasion for rhetoric if it is confusing. Okay, forms of rhetoric. Now what I've done is I've tried to bold the real important stuff. So if this was me personally, I would probably take some physical notes on this, just because writing things down helps me remember the things and it helps me learn things and understand things. And so anyways, I bolded stuff that if I were a person learning this stuff, I would write down. But it's up to you. This presentation is available on Canvas for you, so maybe you don't want to bother with that. Your call. So the first type of rhetorical appeal that I would like to discuss is this word ethos. When you include information based on ethos, the information is based on the character of the speaker. The reputation of the author or speaker is a primary factor in influencing the persuasiveness of the document. Common ways that you would see this out in the world. If you've ever seen an advertisement where they use a spokesperson, they are attempting to kind of leverage that spokesperson's ethos in order to influence you. So when you see a commercial for Hanes Brand's underwear and Michael Jordan is wearing the underwear, you're like, ooh, Michael Jordan. He's legit. Obviously, if he's playing all this hardcore basketball and stuff, he's got to have real comfy, real nice underwear. So perhaps I might want some of that. So that's kind of the general idea. And you can also use ethos in terms of your content. If you are using a source that is associated with a very established or respected group or individual, that definitely enhances ethos as well. But it's something about their character, something about their reputation that enhances the persuasiveness of the document. So I have a silly example for you. I'm sure you're all familiar with Wile E. Coyote, the little cartoon coyote. So this is kind of a tongue-in-cheek Ethos ad based on the struggles of Wile E. Coyote to catch the Road Runner. And of course, the company that Wile E. Coyote is always pulling gadgets from is Acme. So this is an imaginary advertisement for Acme. Acme Gizmotronics, the company that you've trusted for over 100 years, has recently entered the World Wide Web. Now you can purchase our fine products through the internet. Our quality gizmos, widgets, and thingamabobs can be shipped to you within minutes. All come with the famous lifetime guarantee that makes Acme the company that the world depends on for its gizmo needs. Our spokesperson, Mr. Coyote, says, "I'm not really a coyote, but I play one on TV. I've used Acme products for years. Their slingshots, rocket launchers, crowbars, pogo sticks, and power pills are the best around. And don't forget their high-powered dynamite. I buy everything from Acme. They are the company that I trust the most." Acme is currently supporting research into a form of clean, ultra-efficient, cesium-based power that promises to usher in a new period of cheap, globally available power. Based on a small island off the coast of Costa Rica, Acme Technology Research is one of our most significant divisions. Interested in learning more about Acme? We thought you might be. So anyways, main ethos here, we have the well-recognized spokesperson speaking to the trustworthiness of the company, and also they remind us they've been around for 100 years, so they have this long-term reputation that they are leveraging there. Okay, next one, logos. So logos is appeal based on logic or reason. This is the facts, the figures, the statistics, the graphs. That's the data that's backing up whatever your argument is. So almost every argument that you find out there is going to have some logos in there. It's kind of standard. It's sort of the foundation of the argument. We don't often worry as much about pointing out logos in a document as opposed to ethos or the other appeal that we'll talk about momentarily, just because, well, you kind of have to have it. You have to have at least a little bit of it in order to give your argument some credibility. So, the credible description of Acme's very scientific process here, which looks startlingly like an atomic bomb, but we'll ignore that for now, is their scientific explanation and their statistics and facts about this energy creation process. By combining cesium and dihydroxide in laboratory conditions and capturing the released energy, Acme has promised to lead the way into the future. Our energy source is clean, safe, and powerful. No pollutants are released into the atmosphere. The world will soon have an excellent source of clean energy. Acme is currently working towards a patent on our process. Our scientists are exploring ways to use the process in cars, houses, airplanes, and almost anything else that needs power. Acme batteries will be refitted with small dihydrocesium reactors. Once the entire world is powered by Acme's generators, we can all relax and enjoy a much easier life. All right. So that's their kind of logos argument. It's clean, it's safe, it's powerful, it'll make life easier. Yay, practical facts. So, gotta have some of those to get your argument's foundation. Now, our last rhetorical appeal, major appeal, is pathos. So when you think of the word pathos, think of like the word sympathy or empathy. It's the same kind of root word based on emotion or feeling. So a lot of advertisements out there try to leverage pathos because ultimately what makes you susceptible to the influence of advertisements is not necessarily their factual content, but how they make you feel. So there was a commercial long time ago now. I don't know if you maybe have seen it in recent years, though, for the ASPCA. And it was about little animals. And Sarah McLachlan, who came out with kind of a one-hit wonder song, probably back when I was in high school, is in the commercial, and she's holding little puppies with one eye and little kittens stuffed into cages. And the song that she wrote, "In the Arms of the Angel," is playing in the background, and it's just enough to make you cry. So, they leverage their 30 seconds to fit as much like sad, sappy stuff in there as possible in order to influence you to donate to the ASPCA and try to help all of the sad puppies and kittens of the world. So that is one very short example of an emotional appeal. So sad animals, can you find anything more pathetic than that? All right, so the Acme version of Pathos: cesium-based reactor kills. Oh boy. A baby turtle breaks free from the leathery shell of its egg, catching its first glimpse of its first sunrise. It pauses a moment to rest, unaware of the danger that lies so close to it. As the tide comes in, approaching the nest, it also approaches a small pile of metal, cesium. The water draws closer and closer, the turtle unsuspecting of the danger. Finally, the water touches the cesium. The nest is torn to bits in the resulting explosion, destroying even more of an endangered species. Why does this happen? One name: Acme. Acme Gizmotronics is supporting a dihydrocesium reactor, trying, in their anthropocentrism, to squeeze energy out of such destructive explosions. And they are dumping waste cesium onto the shores of their island, threatening the environment. Studies have shown that the dihydrocesium reactor will destroy the island's ecosphere in less than 4 months. How can they get away with this? Costa Rica, where the island is near, has lax environmental laws, allowing Acme to do whatever they want, including destroy endangered species. What can you do about this? Don't let them get away with it. Boycott Acme products and call your representatives and tell them you support stricter legislation to prevent things like this. So, obviously, our Pathos, once again, animal-based. Telling you, it's a heartstring tugger. The little baby turtle that sees its first sunrise and then dies. So, obviously meant to motivate us to boycott Acme products. Just a reminder, Acme's not real. Please don't actually call any representatives about this. Okay. Now, in addition to Pathos, Logos, and Ethos, there are some other ways that we can increase persuasiveness and influence the rhetoric of peace. This acronym, DIRTS, is just a way to remember these methods, so that when you are in an actual rhetorical analysis situation and you're trying to think, okay, what are the things that I can talk about? What are the persuasive, effective things that I can analyze in an article? Then you will think of DIRTS, and you will remember what each letter of this acronym stands for. So, your D is for diction. One thing that an author can use to increase their persuasiveness is word choice. So a good author will definitely amp up, really positive or really negative language in order to influence the way that we think about something. And that word choice is definitely something that you can discuss if you're analyzing a piece. This word right here, this is really effective, or this series of descriptions, that is something that is very persuasive to the audience. Second one, imagery. So imagery is a very broad term, any type of figurative language, metaphors, personification. See, put the word imagery twice. It's really important. Similes, all that kind of stuff. Any sort of comparative language. Those are things that you can point out, assuming that they exist in the piece, as things that help make the piece more persuasive. Now, the R is for repetition. And if you've glanced ahead, you will realize that repetition is actually a type of syntax. See, I even have it listed here. Now, just to make the acronym work, otherwise it'd be DITS, and that sounds silly. Repetition is also listed here, also because it is one of the most important syntax elements that you can point out. So while there are lots of general sentence structure things that you can discuss, the effectiveness of certain varied syntax, the effectiveness of rhetorical questions or anaphora or parallelism. If those words mean nothing, don't worry, I'll talk about them more in a second. Repetition is something you should always be on the lookout for, and there are a lot of different types of repetition that can increase effectiveness as well. So it is a type of syntax, it is a part of syntax, but it's a really important part. So it gets its own letter, and it helps our acronym work a little bit better. So anyways, the T is for tone. You should always, in any sort of rhetorical analysis, something where you're assessing an author's persuasiveness, you should always think about what their tone is. In a really good, sophisticated rhetorical piece, their tone will quite often change throughout the piece. Maybe they start out presenting one type of emotion and feeling about a topic, but then that evolves and it shifts. So keep an eye out for tone, always, and we'll talk about the importance of using sophisticated vocabulary to describe tone, because let me tell you, if on the AP exam you're like, oh, the author's tone is really happy, that's just not going to cut it. So we need to find some good vocabulary to be able to discuss tone in a piece intelligently. And finally, syntax, sentence structure. So all the things that I mentioned before, rhetorical questions, and all of these things, and many other types of sentence structure things can influence the persuasiveness of a piece. So there you go. Dirts. Don't forget about the dirts. Okay, next up. This particular slide I refer to as the 5 C's of persuasive writing. Really ought to title it that, but I'm sure that you could figure it out because all 5 of these start with the letter C. So in a persuasive piece, in an effective persuasive piece, you will be able to identify all of these elements. And when you start writing persuasive pieces and argumentation for me, I should be able to find all 5 of these elements in your arguments. The 5 C's are not a hard and fast structure necessarily. It's not like, one paragraph for each C or anything like that. Some of them are typically grouped together. Some of them can be intermixed and intermingled. Conclusions usually last, but it's not a rigid structure by any means, which is one of the things I like about it, that you do have a little bit of flexibility, and as long as these elements exist in roughly this order, then hopefully you're good. So in a piece, one of the things you always want to look for first is, how does the author catch interest? What do they use in opening their piece that is designed to immediately catch the interest of the reader and make them engaged in the argument itself? Then you should always look for the claim, aka thesis. There usually is one in there. Sometimes in pieces that you read, it will be subtle. Sometimes you can't identify it really clearly in a single sentence until closer to the end. But usually you can see it developing by the beginning of the piece, and then maybe just, it evolves over the course of the article. Convince. So here's where you start getting some of your pathos, logos, ethos kind of stuff. You use your evidence, you use your character and reputation, you use your emotional appeals to support your claim. Now, this C is usually the neglected one. And this C, I think, is the key to being able to get that sophistication point on your AP exam. The counter argument. A lot of times people devote paragraphs and paragraphs to arguing for evidence for evidence that supports their claim, but they completely ignore opposing evidence. And you may be thinking, well, yeah, of course they ignore opposing evidence. I don't want to, argue my opponent's side for them. But in a really effective argument, you should present evidence against your argument. Then you show why it is not sufficient. So of course you're not going to say, well, one reason I'm wrong is this. That would be silly. But you could say, many people believe blah, 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 blah is true about so-and-so issue. However, that is not the full story, or that is not correct, or that is not an accurate interpretation. So you present the opposing arguments and you explain why they do not go. That you explain why your argument is still superior to theirs. So it's almost like if you were going to have an argument with someone, and rather than letting them argue back, you went ahead and said all the stuff they were going to say and explained why they were wrong. You are eliminating the ability of an opponent to argue back. So that is what makes counter-arguments sophisticated, and that is why I strongly recommend them in all of your writings, and maybe start looking for them in other people's writings so you can kind of get the hang of how a good counter-argument is presented in a sophisticated fashion. Okay, and finally, conclude. So re-emphasizing main points, representing claims and evidence. On AP exams, they don't have any specific points that really cover conclusions. I've seen some essays that scored very well that didn't even have a conclusion. In general, of course, for a final draft of an essay that you're turning in to a teacher, you'd want some kind of conclusion. And I'll talk about different ways that you can do that as we go on. But in terms of effective argumentation, it's probably the least crucial part of the argument. Still try and have it, but don't stress about the conclusion when you could be enhancing other aspects of your argumentation. Okay, moving on. The rhetorical triangle. So the reason that I present this rhetorical triangle to you is to try to visually promote the idea that arguing is about more than the message. Now, the message is a good thing. It's up here near the top. Obviously, very, very important, the content that you are arguing. But if you forget about these other aspects, then your argument is not as effective. So when you create an argument, you should be thinking, who is my audience? How can I influence them the best? You would write an argument different if it was to your peers as opposed to the school board or the president, or something like that. You also need to think about yourself. You have ethos, especially if you're writing about an issue that you are connected to in some way. You may have credibility as an author that can lend support to that argument. You should also be considering the rhetorical triangle anytime you analyze an argument. So don't just analyze their message. Who is the speaker? What credibility or authority do they have that lends power to their argument? Who is their audience? What are the beliefs and values of this audience? Why does their audience matter? So considering that context, the context of the communicator, the broader context of the audience, sometimes that can also be a key to sophistication if you have some personal knowledge about either of those things. So, good strategies. Okay, now I give you Space Cat. In a rhetorical analysis essay, which is the first type that we will deal with, Space Cat, in the queue, is a really great way to think about structuring your essays so that it addresses appropriate context. So Space Cat is an acronym for speaker, purpose, audience, context, and exigence. And originally I had planned to have our first set of vocabulary by now, which actually has the word exigence in it, but I don't think that will be till next week. So I will kind of define each of these for you. So speaker, obviously, who is the one delivering the speech or the essay or whatever. That person should be mentioned in your essay, probably in the first paragraph. The purpose of this speaker, so-and-so is writing blah, blah, blah in order to what's goals, what's purpose. You should consider their audience. So remember your rhetorical triangle. The audience matters. Who they are speaking to matters. The context that they are speaking in, what's our time period, significant history around this, just considering, again, that broader context. And then exigence is their need. What need, what impetus did they have in order to write this piece or to make this speech or to do this thing? What was it that pushed them to put pen to paper and create this persuasive piece, whatever persuasive piece you are analyzing? So for the cat bit, choices, appeals, tone. Think of this as the format for the body of your essay. If this is the introduction, where you're telling us, in so-and-so's speech, she has so-and-so purpose and is speaking to this audience in this context, and here's her need for writing, and blah, 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 blah. And she does all this by using particular choices. Think like, what's the word I'm looking for? Dirts. So diction, imagery, syntax. She uses particular appeals, ethos, pathos, logos, and has so-and-so tone to try to persuade us. So if you can remember Space Cat, and then within Space Cat, there's a little bit of dirts there. That kind of gives you some acronyms and some guides and a little bit of structure for when you start analyzing rhetorical pieces. Okay, now, when you are trying to make arguments, sometimes arguments go wrong. And gosh, the internet is such a beautiful place for discovering these particular argument flaws. Logical fallacies are when you have an error in reasoning, unintentional or intentional. You are trying to influence the reader, but you end up simplifying or distorting evidence in a way that is not accurate. You try to use logic, but the logic does not go. So this was one particular logical fallacy I saw floating around social media around the time that Governor Cooper gave us the mandatory face mask rules. So it says, requiring face masks 3 months into a pandemic is like requiring condoms at the baby shower. So kind of a shocking simile there, Face masks are like condoms, and obviously our society is already pregnant. Maybe not quite. So obviously the reason this is a logical fallacy is that at the time that face masks were required, less than 1% of our population had actually contracted the coronavirus. Since a person cannot be 1% pregnant, comparing infection to pregnancy is not quite accurate. So that analogy is faulty, even though, face masks and condoms may be quite similar. They both do provide a measure of protection. Pandemic infection and babies, not the same. So that was an example of a logical fallacy. And this is the type of logical fallacy it is, the faulty analogy fallacy. So the faulty analogy fallacy says, well, if two things are alike in some way, they're alike in other ways. It is also known as the apples to oranges fallacy. This was another one that came out around the time they were debating whether schools should be open or not. And Governor Ron from Texas or something like that, some state that was very infected at the time, said, I'm confident if you can do Home Depot, if you can do Walmart, if you can do these things, we absolutely can do the schools. So he's comparing a trip to Home Depot or Walmart to a trip to school. But again, faulty analogy, Governor Ron. So the what's his name? This guy, greatest man in the world or whatever, points out the flaw in that. I don't always go to Home Depot, but when I do, I tend not to go for 5 days in a row for 7 hours at a time. So pointing out that The similarities between schools and Home Depot, not quite there. So anyways, that's an example of that. Another faulty analogy, logical fallacy here, occurred when we had the, what's his name? U.S. Navy guy. I'm not good at military titles. He directed his staff to begin crafting an order that would prohibit Confederate battle flags from all public spaces and work areas aboard Navy installations, ships, aircraft, and submarines. And of course, there was an uproar. How dare you take down the Confederate flags from these places, blah, blah, blah. So one comment said, "You are a bunch of wimps to give in to pressure. How do you ever expect to win a war?" And of course, the U.S. Navy responded, "Missiles." So they were unpersuaded by this logical fallacy, the implication that taking down a flag would in some way make them less effective at bombing the snot out of everybody, which I'm sure they're very capable of doing. So that one is another type of logical fallacy. Here is another type, the anecdotal evidence fallacy. An anecdote is a short story or tale. So an anecdotal evidence fallacy uses a personal example to determine the entire argument. So some recent examples related to the kind of new civil rights movement we have going on here. If you say that police brutality isn't real because you haven't experienced it, well, I've never been, beat up by the police, so obviously police brutality is not an issue. Or saying that, racism isn't real because Black people and, well, obviously, racism is a thing of the past. It is not an issue in this society today. So your personal life experience is not actually an effective argument. Ultimately, it is a logical fallacy. Another type, the ad hominem fallacy. Rather than attacking the argument, you attack the person. You will see a lot of ad hominem fallacy during the upcoming political arena that we are about to have, because this is one of politicians' favorite things to do. They think that they can invalidate a person's argumentation or what's the word I'm looking for? Like their policies and things like that by attacking the person themselves. If they can prove that this person has done something immoral, that should prove that they are a less effective leader. So if you try to attack someone's education, oh, well, you only graduated from high school, so you don't get to have an opinion about this. Well, it's not necessarily a valid argument. Or one of my favorites, instead of actually engaging in a discussion, being like, "Oh, look at you, you sensitive little snowflake." So that is kind of a cop-out and a way to avoid addressing the argument by just attacking the person. Okay, red herring fallacy. This is another one that I've seen a lot on social media recently, diverting away from the actual argument by bringing up another issue. So sometimes you really feel like this other issue, is relevant, but really you're not actually defeating the person's argument because you're just saying, "Look over there," at some other issue. So a very common one when people would bring up, issues with the police, when they were talking about, defunding the police or police brutality or systemic racism, is a lot of people would say, "Well, what about black on black crime?" Okay, it is also violence, but ultimately it's an entirely different issue. These two issues would not be addressed or solved in the same ways. So ultimately, even though it is an issue, it's not an issue that is relevant to this argument, distracting from this argument. Sometimes I've seen red herrings that are even less related. People are talking about police brutality or whatever, and people are like, "But what about abortion?" Well, what about it? So, yeah, sure, it's a problem. We can talk about that separately, but you can't just distract from what's going on by, bringing up random issues wrong with the world to distract from something that you clearly don't want to talk about. So, anyways, that is a general rundown. Logical fallacies. So, lots of information there. Hope I haven't totally overloaded you. Just to make it a little bit more intense, I have this document here, and I am not going to go over this whole thing now. It's rather long, but this document has some terms that you should probably be familiar with. Don't necessarily need to have an exact definition. I'm not going to quiz you on any of these, but these are some things that if you know these terms and you can discuss them intelligently, then they can be really great things to have in a rhetorical analysis essay. So I have a lot of logical fallacies in here. You may have seen red herring was up here just a moment ago. I have some terms that I would expect you to know. If you don't know what a simile is by now, I may be like a little worried. But I also have some that I feel like you will be less familiar with. So juxtaposition, great term to know, and it just describes a sharp contrast between two things in order to advance an argument. So you say, well, in this section of the argument, the author uses the juxtaposition between this and this, pointing out the differences between these things in order to make X point. So there are some really good terms in here, and I will address a lot of them as we go along. If you were to glance over them and be familiar with them, then that would be a helpful thing for you, but it's not a necessary thing. These are just here for you as an available resource. Okay, next up, thesis statements. So I told you we'd be talking about the thesis statement. It is the foundation of your argument. You really can't make an effective argument without a solid thesis statement. The odds of you being able to string together an excellent line of reasoning with evidence and commentary without a thesis statement is slim to none. I really haven't seen it done. So the key to a thesis statement is that it is clear and that it presents your position on the issue. It's really kind of the whole point of it. So looking at the guidelines on the left here for a second, good thesis states the writer's clearly defined opinion or analysis of some subjects. In general, you want to avoid using personal expressions, saying I think, I believe. Really, if you have something like that in a thesis statement, just take it out. The sentence is probably fine without it, and I'll show you that in just a moment. You want to have one clearly defined position. Don't attack too much in your thesis statement. You, of course, want to fit the assignment or the prompt or the argument that you are trying to claim. Typically, you would like to put the thesis statement at the end of the first paragraph. Now, I mentioned that on the AP exam, they'll give you the point for the thesis no matter where it is. It doesn't have to be at the end of the first paragraph, but if you don't have it there, sometimes it can derail other parts of your argument. So if you don't state your thesis statement until the end of your essay, sure, you'll still get the point for the thesis. But if the rest of your essay didn't establish that strong line of reasoning, then it can really hamper other aspects of your argument. The evidence section can be less strong. So it's a good habit to get into to locate the thesis at the end of the first paragraph. Sometimes a thesis will begin by addressing the other side's position, and there's actually this nice little list of formulas, and this point kind of addresses other side plus clear position option. But I'll go through these one by one. So sometimes you just state a clear position, and that's fine. In order to promote the healthy development, parents should limit the amount of time their children spend staring or interacting with screens. Now, I mentioned that you want to avoid using personal expressions. If you had inserted the words I think or I believe there, it still would have been a clear position. You'd still get the point on an AP essay, but see how much better it sounds without it. Rather than just stating, well, I think that, you're stating it as if it is fact, as if you have examined the evidence and this is just the way it should be. Not just you think this, but many people think this. So that's one reason why it's good to avoid stuff like that. Sometimes, in a very sort of formulaic thesis, you can have your position and then you kind of list your points that you're going to discuss, and that's fine. And if that helps give you a guideline for how your paper is going to look, by all means, do that. Then there's the addresses other side plus position. So that's maybe more slightly sophisticated way to begin your thesis. While human cloning may have scientific benefits, so addressing something that you don't totally agree with, the practice should not be legalized because of its potential for abuse. Okay, so could have just said human cloning should not be legalized because of its potential for abuse, but by kind of like making a concession to the other side, it does make it seem like you know more about their position, as if you have examined their position and been like, that's nice, but still don't agree. So it makes it seem a little stronger from the start. And again, you could have a variation where you kind of list your 3 points, organize the rest of your essay accordingly. Let's see. Then there's the qualifies a position, where you're not totally for something or against something, so you have to kind of like explain why you're sort of in the middle on an issue. But yeah, so those are some kind of different thesis options. But in all of them, and all of these would definitely receive a point on the AP exam, but in all of them, it's really clear what the rest of the essay is going to look like and what sort of things are going to be discussed. Okay, thesis practice. And this is short, I promise. So OWL at Purdue is a really, really great writing resource. If you haven't used them for anything, they've got some really excellent resources. But they've got this hopefully super easy little thesis practice here for you to do. And for each one, you will select what you think the strongest thesis is. Which one of these 4 statements would be the most likely to get a point? Which one is the most specific? Which one establishes the strongest line of reasoning? So you make your choice, whatever your choice is, and then you press check, and it will tell you. And then you can go on to the next one. And, I think there's only like 5 of them. So try that out, see how you do. If you get one of these wrong, this is designed to be pretty straightforward, but if you get one of these wrong and you don't understand why, please contact me. Let me know and be like, I'm just not quite sure why this is a stronger thesis than this. And I'll try and point out what the important bit is. So try out the thesis practice just for funsies. Okay. Now, I know I've laid a lot at your feet here. I've got one more article to read with you, and then I have a mission, and then that's about it. So, how am I doing on time? Still doing good. Okay, cool. So the title of this article is Social Media Can Be Deadly. Right off the get-go, in the title, we already have a claim. So Leonard Pitts has made it very easy for us. It is pretty clear that he is going to be talking about the issues, the concerns with social media and technology. So we have our claim in our title. That's nice. So keep an eye out for the other 5 C's. So just to remind you, we have catch interest. How does he catch our interest? We have claim. So, here it is, but obviously he's going to restate it at some points throughout the essay. We have convince. So he needs to have some information to convince us that social media is indeed an issue in some way. We have counter arguments. He's got to make some counter arguments if this is a good, sophisticated argument. And we have a conclusion. Okay, so I'm going to read this article with you since I've overloaded you with so much stuff. And then I will kind of try and point out the 5 C's here. Okay, social media can be deadly. The thing might be funny, except that somebody died. That part isn't funny at all. But the rest of it, the moments before Justin Valdez was killed, read like some twisted skit on Saturday Night Live. You have to get the picture as captured on surveillance video and described by authorities in a story published last week by the San Francisco Chronicle. You have to see the suspect, 30-year-old Nikum Tepekason, sitting on the light rail train, pulling out his .45 caliber pistol, pointing it across the aisle, putting it back, pulling it out several times again, and at one point wiping his nose with the hand holding the gun. And nobody notices because they're too busy staring down at their smartphones and tablet computers. We're talking about a train crowded with commuters, and this guy is waving a gun, but nobody sees him. So engrossed are they in texting, tweeting, and playing Angry Birds. Finally, according to police, Tepekason shot Valdez in the back of the head as the 20-year-old college student was exiting the train. That got people's attention. Indeed, the apparently random September 23rd tragedy has rocked the Bay Area. It ought to rock the whole country. In the murder of Justin Valdez and the bizarre scenario leading up to it, we find fresh, albeit bloody, evidence of how social media and high technology have changed us. These devices and new platforms of communication were supposed to allow us to be better connected to one another. Take this murder as Exhibit A for the argument that they actually do the opposite. Granted, they provide a link to someone who is not there, but it is at the cost of separation from someone who is. Next time you're on a plane waiting for takeoff, next time you're on public transit, next time you're in a restaurant, count all the eyes fixed to all the screens, all the ears stuffed with tiny white buds, all the spaces that once would have been filled with casual conversation and eye contact, now filled by the silence of people who are not there, people who occupy the same place at the same time, worlds apart. Then these people go home to their families where they watch separate programs in separate rooms while the kids retreat to rooms of their own to text and tweet the night away. Because we have all these new options for self-entertainment, and the option we most frequently choose, it seems, is to be alone together. Your humble correspondent is as guilty as anyone. Indeed, with an introvert's instinct for solitude, he may be guiltier than most. But even an introvert can see there is something wrong with this picture. Even an introvert can feel something is lost when human connectivity, human society, human intercourse are reduced to pixels on a screen, and everybody is looking down. Yes, it sounds like an abstract plaint, the kind of observation one makes when one is paid to navel gaze and think big thoughts. However, the death of Justin Valdez robs us of the luxury of believing this does not matter or has no real-world application. This killing may speak to our refusal to take guns out of the hands of those who should not have them. It might bear upon our unwillingness to impose safeguards, ensuring that those who need mental health care receive it. But surely it speaks at least as loudly and directly to the alienation and disconnect which have been the ironic, unintended consequences of devices and platforms designed to bring us together. After all, Justin Valdez is dead, at least in part, because it is now possible to wave a gun around in a crowded train without being noticed. Technology has trained us to look down in search of connection. This man's death is a cruel reminder. You need to look up sometimes as well. All right. So first, I just would like to state this is a completely true story. I actually saw the media footage when it happened, and I mean it's exactly the way that he describes it. Like he's standing there, next to the doors, people crowded around the train, gun out in the air, and no one notices. It's kind of crazy to watch. So, anyways. Really true story, and obviously Leonard Pitts is using this narrative to make a point. This poor kid, 20-year-old college student, he's dead. And, we can blame a lot of things, but maybe we need to lay a little blame at technology's feet. Maybe technology is at least like a teensy wit responsible for that, So, anyways. Thinking about our 5 C's and just being aware of any other things we notice along the way. Our first C, catch interest. Leonard Pitts does that immediately. And one thing I think he does really well here is juxtaposition. So the thing might be funny, happy, something good, something entertaining, except that somebody died. Died. That's dark. That's bad. That's a contrast. Funny. Died. Those are very contrasting things. So, just saying somebody died, that would probably be, catching in its own way, but the thing might be funny, except that somebody died. Well, the contrast between funny and died, that definitely catches our interest. That juxtaposition of those two opposite ideas definitely catches our interest. So he gives us this narrative about the tale, and then we start to get claim. So we had it in the title, but now Leonard Pitts is arguing that social media and high technology have changed us. Fairly uncontroversial claim. I don't think anyone would deny that. But then he goes on to say, these devices actually do the opposite. They disconnect us from other people, perhaps even more than they connect us to other people. Okay, now that's something we could definitely argue with, because, technology does connect us to people for sure, but Leonard Pitts is arguing that the disconnect from the people around us is dangerous, potentially dangerous at least. Okay, so we start getting some convinced stuff, and Leonard Pitts does a really excellent job of using sentence structure to help develop this. For example, in this paragraph here, next time you're on a plane waiting for takeoff, next time you're on public transit, next time you're in a restaurant. So that repetition of next time, that kind of parallel structure of the sentence really highlights all the different situations that technology has taken over. And let's see, here we have some more repetition. Then these people go home to their families where they watch separate programs in separate rooms. The emphasis of the word separate, because he is trying to make the point that technology separates us. It connects us, but it separates us, and we don't consider that separation often enough. All right, now that he's given us, this narrative, these kind of general public examples, now we start to get some counter arguments. So first, he makes a concession. Your humble correspondent is guilty as anyone. So he tries to say to us, I do it too. I am not immune. I am guilty too. But I can still see that there is something wrong. So just because you do this doesn't mean that you can't point out the issue that is happening in the society. So there's kind of counter argument number one. Then we get some other common counter arguments. He anticipates some kind of red herring arguments and defeats them right off the get-go. So he says, this killing may speak to our refusal to take guns out of the hands of those who should not have them. Anytime there's a shooting, there's a debate about gun control. And he's like, dude, I don't care about gun control. Gun control is not the issue right now. Don't talk to me about gun control. It might bear upon our unwillingness to impose safeguards ensuring that those who need mental health care receive it. If we have a mass shooting, mental health always comes up. Well, that guy was crazy. Well, that guy needed therapy, whatever, blah, blah, blah. So again, Leonard Pitts says, this is not the issue. This is not what I want to talk about. So, reemphasizes the alienation, the disconnect. That's what I'm concerned about. This kid died because of these issues. We can't just ignore them and be like, oh, well, that happens. So, for the conclusion, he does something very effective, and this is a great way to think about conclusions if you have trouble with conclusions. It's short, it's sweet, but it harkens back to a previous point in the essay. And making that connection to that previous point makes it a very effective conclusion. So let's see, somewhere up here, looking down. Oh no, I just had it. Okay, well, there was somewhere up here that, there it is. Sorry, it's a little farther down than I thought. Everybody is looking down. So that's kind of part of the argument, is that everyone is disconnected, everyone is looking down. So then at the very end, technology has trained us to look down in search of connection. So hearkening back to that previous point, this man's death is a cruel reminder. You need to look up sometimes as well. So that's kind of a reiteration of the claim, and also a sort of contrast from the looking up to the looking down to the looking up. So anyways, so that is a 5 C's verbal analysis, as well as a little bit of effective sentence structure stuff pointed out there. Normally I would ask you guys to point those things out to me, but online lessons, right? Okay, your mission. I have given you an essay. Actually, it's a speech, but it's written in essay form, obviously. So in this speech by Sandra Day O'Connor, who is the first woman who served on the U.S. Supreme Court, to give you some context for her, you need to find the 5 C's: catch interest, claim, convince, counterargument, conclude, somewhere in this essay. And any additional things you see, I would expect you to find maybe at least 1 or 2 of these things. You don't have to find all of them. Not all of them are there. But at least 1 or 2 of these other things, I would expect you to find them and point them out as well. So my recommendation, just copy the whole blessed thing, put it into a Google document, and rather than having to retype things, just highlight whatever section you think is whichever C or whichever rhetorical device, and just put a comment on it. And if you're not familiar with how to create a comment in Google Docs, then I have an explanation there. But yeah, so that is your mission, to label those things and then share the document and submit it. And that concludes our persuasive introduction.